to conclusions and we got it. Okay. And then we'll go into those conclusions and recommendations, and then we'll finish with some reflections from both of us. So to get us started, Rosie's going to talk about what we've been doing.
Yeah, so for 3 months from June to the very beginning of September, we were in Bulgaria working with a nonprofit called the Green Balkans, learning all about wildlife conservation in an international context. And you'll hear more about it later, but you're going to hear a lot about Sacred Falcons and Sacred Falcon Reintroduction throughout this project, because that was the main subject of one of our deliverables. We had 2 deliverables. The first was that we each wrote a paper on Sacred Falcon Reintroduction, one on diets and one on artificial nest use. And then we also created these things called bird bios as a way to do some public outreach at the center we were working at. So to give you a little bit of a sense of place as to where we were, here is Bulgaria. It is in Eastern Europe. It's just above Greece and Turkey, sits along the Black Sea. We were in the middle of the country in Stara Zagora, where that little red star just popped up. And it has a huge diversity of landscapes. So there are plains and mountains, coastal environments, wetlands, just about everything. And there are a lot of protected areas as well. So there are 3 major national parks and over 1,000 smaller protected areas as well. And with all of that protected land, there's a huge chance for biodiversity. One of the main things we worked with were birds. So we wanted to share a handful of the bird species that we worked with. You can see that tall picture is of a griffin vulture. There's a lesser kestrel, an imperial eagle, a bearded vulture. Then in the bottom corner, there are some sacred falcons. And all of these species face some sort of a threatened conservation status within Bulgaria. So that really highlights the importance of the work of our project partner, who Molly will introduce.
Nope. Okay, well, Green Balkans, they are an environmental NGO, a nonprofit that's based in Bulgaria. They work with a number of international groups and other regional local groups. They focus on wildlife conservation with a special emphasis on Balkan birds. So we were at their wildlife breeding and rehabilitation center in Stara Zagora, and it's got these 2 sides to it. It's got Old Base and New Base. At New Base, it's focused on, it has the veterinary clinic. It focuses on intended care for injured birds that are brought into the center. And then Old Base is where we were at, and that is their, it has their breeding aviaries, and then it also has their visitors corner, which is their public facing education center, and has a number of aviaries with birds for the public to see. So some of their breeding programs, they involve sacred falcons, of course, as we're going to be talking way more about, large kestrels, black vultures, a number of other vultures, and just other native birds such as ducks and stuff. And then they also house a couple of their ambassador birds in the visitors corner, which are birds that they'll take to outreach events. And so Rosie and I got to attend one, the Uzana Festival, and it was a conservation nature festival. And so we went with some birds, and we just talked about Green Balkans mission, and we focused on generating donations through that. And then they also, Green Balkans does a number of other outreach events, such as releasing birds of various kinds. They released storks, some ducks while we were there. And then at every one of these events, they kind of gather some sort of kestrel, lesser or common, and then they just kind of release them as party favors at each event, basically. And then unfortunately, we couldn't participate in everything due to the language barrier, but we were as involved as we possibly could. And so Green Balkans is who we worked with extensively to come up with our deliverables. That way, what we were producing would have an effect for them and a positive effect. So before we get into those deliverables, though, we are now going to go to these social ecological systems at play in this area. So here's just like a really quick little social ecological system web. It's very complicated, as you can see. We spent a lot of time trying to wrap our head around it. And this is only for like what's affecting our project and our time in Bulgaria. So we're going to delve into those specifics now.
Yeah, so we're just going to highlight a few of the main points that we really want to hit on that we feel affected our project and deliverables, and just our overall experience, starting with people and a basic connection to nature. This basic connection is really captured well in this creation story that we were told multiple times throughout our stay in Bulgaria. The story goes that when God was distributing land to the people of Earth, he gave everyone a different piece. So some people got mountains, some people got plains. And while he was doing that, the Bulgarians were out working in their fields. And so by the time they showed up, God had run out of land to give, but he wanted to reward them for working so hard all day. So he decided instead to give them a piece of paradise that had everything in it. And when people told us this story, they really had a sense of pride in it. There are a lot of different creation stories in Bulgaria, but this was the one people really stuck to, and it seemed to emphasize kind of the specialness that they felt about the land that they were living on. You can see some other connections in just a quick basic sense. There's that caring connection through things like cultural celebrations, like a celebration for spring that involves storks. There's that connection through encouraging the use of local medicines, which we were often told, go use this plant for your mosquito bites. And also in harvesting a lot of locally grown food. So here you can see Molly picking some linden flowers for tea to have later on. And obviously these links are a lot more complicated, but so we're going to start diving into that now with some historical context. Bulgaria has an incredibly long history. And one thing to note throughout that history, as one local phrased it, is that Bulgarians love fighting, but they're not very good at winning. So they've been involved in a lot of conflicts, but they've also been conquered by a lot of other civilizations. And you can see some of those civilizations on this timeline. For example, the Roman Empire was in control for a while, then the Byzantine Empire. One of the more recent and significant periods was when the Ottoman Empire took over, and that 500-year period, which ended over about 150 years ago, was seen as this one of really oppressive control. And we want to highlight that period because we feel like it's a good introduction to this approach to problem solving that we saw while we were in Bulgaria. When people were faced with problems, whether it was a personal problem or an organizational problem, they tended to have this attitude of, it is what it is. So instead of trying to face it head on and take individual action, there was more of this attitude of, well, that's the problem, just got to live with it. We'll move on now. As you can imagine, that has huge implications for the level of action taken toward environmental problems in Bulgaria. And it's something that Molly and I talked a lot about, and we feel it stems significantly from these multiple periods of being overtaken and conquered by other societies. Molly's going to provide some information on some recent historical events that will touch on this a little bit more, as well as some of the other environmental issues in the country.
Yeah, so more recent than the Ottoman Empire is the communist era. This is when Bulgaria became a part of the USSR. This started right after World War II and lasted about 45 years. So this led to a number of social, ecological, and economic pressures on the ecosystems of Bulgaria and in turn the Sacred Falcons. One of these social governance structures that they set up was this idea of collectivization. Collectivization is the idea to basically pool all resources and work together as a community to produce. One of the Soviet Union's big things that they really wanted to do was produce. And so they did this collectivization idea, and it led to a number of issues, including land abandonment and agriculture intensification. And these led to a couple of issues, both the decline of the Sacred Falcons, and it affected their main prey source, the European suslik. And losing the main prey item is detrimental to any species. So of course, that negatively affected the Sacred Falcons. And then a part of this push was the use of rodenticides and pesticides. And as you can imagine, that has effects all the way throughout ecosystems affecting prey. And much of communism, collectivization looks great on paper and then tends to fail in real life. And this only exacerbates all of these issues that it created. And then another push to produce is through industrialization. And this led to a number of issues with pollution. As I hope we all know by now, pollution is very, very bad for the environment in many ways. So I'll just leave it at that. And then we also want to mention this idea of distrust, which we can see probably even further than the communist era, but we want to mention it here because it's particularly unique given that it's a top-down governance structure in Bulgaria. But we'll go into more of the details of what distrust does later. But we just want to point it out here. So then moving into the fall of communism, Bulgaria gained its official independence from the USSR in 1990. And the fall of the USSR started back in the 1980s, everything before that. But it led to a lot of political and economic turmoil. One of these issues was that it just kind of continued the environmental degradation that was already happening. And politically, it was hard to create any sort of legislation during this time, much less anything conservationally speaking. So there wasn't a whole lot in terms of conservation policies created at this time. And then in 1995, Bulgaria submitted its application to join the EU, and they've officially joined in 2007. So it was about a 12-year period, and it was fraught with a lot of tension between the environmental groups and the economic interests in other local groups. And so due to the distrust that I just mentioned in the communist era, that really affected what was happening because nobody really trusted the government, much less the EU. And so from 2002 to 2007, Green Balkans spearheaded the ecological inventories that the EU requires in order to join. And that was a long process as well, fraught with the same tension. And there's a lot of back and forth between environmental groups, the economic groups, and eventually the EU supported the originally proposed plan to conserve 34% of Bulgaria. So that is a huge amount of its land that is conserved, or that is set aside especially for conservation. And then we want to mention this idea of symbolic transformation, which is something that Cited et al. 2015 proposed. And it's basically that no formal transformation took place, which left the imprint of an idealistic revolution. And that resulted in false harmonization and a lack of real lasting change for effective conservation measures, which sums up the whole accession process. But there was some positive change that came from the accession to the EU. That includes knowledge sharing. There's a huge network for conservation and sharing everything that people know. It also provided access to a lot of laws, such as the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive. And it also gave them access to the Natura 2000 network, which is something that the EU is a special program of the EU. And that is for creating a network of protected lands and marine areas. And then we also want to mention this social identity crisis that is kind of happening at this time. As you saw, they have an extremely long history, and they've this time only really been a country for about 31 years, and only about 5 of those years were they beholden to only itself and its citizens. And then very quickly started that accession process, which means that they're conforming to standards of the EU, which one could easily argue are the ideas of Anglo-Saxon Western Europeans. So they haven't really spent a whole lot of their time independent of these higher governing powers. And that's kind of created this social identity crisis that they're feeling, with ripple effects throughout economic endeavors, policies, and ecological protections. But to get into some more just kind of modern day things that are happening, I'll send it back over to Rosie.
So there's going to be a quiz on communism. But yeah, just to hit on a few more points that are really relevant to conservation and our project in this region. Bulgaria currently does not have a fully formed government. So far this year, they have hosted 2 parliamentary elections, both of which failed to form a government. They're about to host a 3rd later this month. And on top of an unformed government, corruption continues to be a problem. Transparency International ranks Bulgaria as the most corrupt country in the EU. Elections were needed this year after their prime minister stepped down after anti-corruption protests against him and his party. And protests from earlier this year highlighted things like links between those in power with the mafia, and judiciary reforms, and issues with freedom of speech. And simply put, there are a lot of laws that are not enforced and a lot of bribes that are taken. So a lack of law enforcement causes some major problems when trying to enforce conservation laws, obviously. For example, illegal hunting is a big issue, and one that Green Balkans works continually to try and combat. Another big issue, especially for saker falcons, is nest robbing. Nest robbing acted as kind of a final blow to their population in the 1980s, which could likely be linked with some of the economic turmoil during that time. Nest robbing, whether it's taking chicks or eggs from a nest, was done because those birds were then put to use for falconry, which was really popular and still is in the Middle East, and those birds are highly valued for falconry. One other consideration is that despite a cultural connection to nature, from conversations we had and research that we did, we found that people wanted and needed economic incentives to participate in conservation. And from our research, we couldn't find any programs that existed for those types of incentives, whether it was payments for ecosystems, services plans, or anything like that. And finally, we want to mention a general misinformation surrounding a lot of bird species. So there are very few environmental nonprofits in the country, and therefore there aren't many people working on environmental education. One of the biggest examples we saw surrounding misinformation is that a lot of ranchers thought that birds of prey, especially things and large raptors, especially birds like vultures, would kill and hunt their livestock. That's largely untrue because vultures are a scavenger species, so they don't really hunt. But the ranchers still felt threatened, so a lot of the time they will poison vultures. And that is a rampant issue. One of the ways Green Balkans tries to deal with that is having one-on-one conversations with those people, but those don't always work, and that's a very time-consuming process. With those considerations in mind, we want to talk about one more element before we get to our deliverables, which is funding.
Funding. Oh, here's Green Balkans. You can see here, there's the, going back a little bit, there's the Uzana Festival, the Visitors Corner sign. And this is the little pond that you can see from the Visitors Corner through your walkabout. It's got things like pelicans, storks, ducks, all that good stuff.
Mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, keep you on your toes. Okay, back to funding. So Green Balkans works with a number of international and national funders. One of the national funders is the Bulgaria Ministry of Environment and Water, and they primarily fund a majority of Green Balkans facility maintenance. And then they also rely a lot on public donations to help care for their birds. And then a part of the EU, they get this Life Plus funding, which is mostly used for funding for their vulture breeding programs. And it does help fund the monitoring. And as we know, as a part of adaptive management, that is very critical to conservation. So that's awesome for Life Plus. And since it is a part of the EU, they have very strict standards and ones that whoever is getting the funding must uphold. So that's also a source of accountability. And then in terms of how funding interacts with our own project, the Saker Falcons and bird bios, for the Sakers, the Mohammed bin Zayed Raptor Conservation Fund is the main source of funds for the Saker Falcon Conservation Project. And that's based out of the United Arab Emirates. And that's particularly interesting because they fund a majority of Saker Falcon reintroduction programs worldwide. And their motivations for that are because falconry is super important in the Middle East, and the Saker Falcon is especially valuable as a part of the falconry business. And so understanding these social motivations really helps impact the ecological considerations that we have to take into consideration. And so that's also critical for building and maintaining these relationships, especially on an international scale in conservation. So we just want to mention that. And then in terms of the bird bios, we realized over the course of the entire summer how important donations are to a center like this, especially to the care of its birds. And so we wanted to kind of help build those through our bird bios, and we'll go into that a lot more later. But we're actually going to go into our deliverables now.
The part you've all been waiting for, actually. So we wanted to emphasize these social ecological systems to such a great degree because they really played into our overall experience and into our deliverables, both in why they're necessary and how they're shaped and structured. So we produced 2 types of deliverables, 2 papers on the Saker Falcon Reintroduction Project, and these bird bios, these profiles on birds at the center. So to start, we're going to talk about our papers. So when we first started communicating with Green Balkans, they expressed a need for people to help them compile some information surrounding this reintroduction project. They had shared some of the major details and kept track of those, but had kind of let all the other details fall through the cracks. So they needed someone to talk to everyone and figure out what all the data was that they had come up with so far. So to give you some background on this project, Saker falcons were declared extinct in Bulgaria about 20 years ago. They're still considered an endangered species across the world by the IUCN. Their causes for decline in habitat include habitat loss, pollution, poisoning, nest robbing. But in 2015, Green Balkans started a captive breeding program to try and reintroduce these birds to Bulgaria and to establish a wild breeding population within the country. So far they have hatched and released from the center 89 chicks, which is really awesome. And this last summer was the most successful summer so far. They had 17 chicks that they put out. Birds are released using the hacking method. You can see a hack there. It's basically this big metal nursery nest. And at about a month old, the chicks are taken away from their parents at the breeding center and put into one of these hacks, which has a closed lid on it. That way they can get used to being outside in their environment, but they can't get eaten by things that would eat a baby chick. And after about 2 weeks, once all their baby fluff is gone, the hacks are opened and they're free to explore and eventually to migrate south. It's important to try and keep these chicks in the area for as long as possible. The longer they stay near these hacks and their original release site, the more likely they are to live into adulthood and the more likely they are to return to the area to breed. So you can do that by choosing a good spot to put the hack that has great habitat, but also providing extra food, which Molly will talk about more. They do a lot of monitoring of these hack sites with a lot of help from locals who have information from like every day, seeing what sacred falcons are up to. So they are able to talk, especially with a lot of local shepherds, to see what is going on in the area, what birds are there, how they're interacting, and where exactly they're at. So it's easier to find them. And through public information like that in 2018, Green Balkans discovered that there is one breeding pair of sacred falcons in Bulgaria now. It's made up of birds that were released from this program. So since it has the potential to be a really successful project and a successful breeding program, it's really important to make sure you're capturing all of the details of that project so you can recreate it. So Molly's going to talk a little bit about our methodology for putting together these papers.
Yeah, so to actually produce these papers, a lot of the information we had to actually write it down and gather it. And so we wanted to apply a lot of the tools that we learned through the master's program. So we conducted a few semi-formal and informal interviews to help get this information onto paper. And then we also did a literature review, and that was to kind of help fill any gaps that we had in our research or from talking to everybody. And it also helped provide critical analysis and also helped inform future potential research that could go on related to the project. And then we also relied heavily on firsthand experience. We spent every day cutting up dead baby animals to feed to the birds. We also went out to hack sites. We got to help release some sakers. We helped look for trees for artificial nests. And then we actually got to help install the final artificial nest of the season, which was very exciting. And so once we had gathered all this information, we set about writing our papers. So I'll start off with the paper that I wrote. It's For the Sake of Survival, Diets of Captive Sacred Falcons and Breeding Programs. And so I also tried to provide a bit of a critical analysis for this because there were a number of interesting findings, which I'll go into now. So for one, variance in diet is extremely critical to birds. And with that comes a difference in breeding versus the non-breeding season and what you feed the birds. During the breeding season, they get a mix of yolk-in, day-old chicks, rats, and quail. And in the non-breeding season, they get a mix of day-old chicks, rabbits, chickens, sometimes a bit of beef, and very occasionally rats. Rats are more expensive, so they try to shy away from those in the non-breeding season. And part of that is because there's a difference in that because producing chicks and especially eggs is very taxing to an animal. So they have to kind of change and make sure that the bird is getting enough nutrition and supplements to maintain their own healthy standards and then pass that on to the chick. And so when they are released at the hack site, they get a mix of these lighter, bright foods like the white rats and everything, and then they get switched over to more brown, dull foods, such as brown rats, brown rabbits, quails, things like that. Because in the wild, they won't be finding these bright lab rats, they won't be finding day-old chicks to eat. So they have to get used to that. So that's why they kind of switched it over during that time. The hacks are fed twice a day, and then food is also placed at the feeding table, as you can see. And this is viewable from the hacks, so the bird kind of learns where it can go to get food later. And part of this is to keep the young in the area longer. That way, as Rosie mentioned, hopefully they return later to breed once they become sexually mature. And then also the sacred falcon is an altricial species, which means that the parents help rear the young, gain their wings, if you will. And so in a way, the center is helping recreate that natural occurrence by providing food for the young. And then this season, there were a number of dead in shell, which isn't good. Obviously, you want to try and produce as many chicks, healthy chicks as possible. And so whenever the center performed an autopsy, they found that gout was the main source of this death. And they found that to most likely be caused by the diets, especially because they're adding these extra supplements. And since some of these supplements are fat soluble, they think that maybe they're building up in the tissues and that passed on to the chick. And that's not good. It causes gout, death. And so versus the water soluble ones that can get passed through the digestive system. And then we also want to mention this idea of proactive versus reactive conservation, which Rosie and I kind of cover both sides of that. Diets are mostly reactive because if something goes wrong, like it did this year, all you can really do is change it in the future. So it's a very reactive sort of response. And which they are planning on reducing the supplements next year to see if that makes any difference. I'm hoping to kind of provide a more proactive element by writing this paper, making this information available for other breeding centers. So hopefully they don't have to hit the same pitfalls and then fix them, and they can avoid those before they even get to them. But speaking of our other paper, I'll send it over to Rosie.
Yes, so my paper is The Nest Best Thing, Using Artificial Nests to Assist Sacred Falcon Reintroduction Efforts in Bulgaria. As Molly mentioned, my paper focuses a lot on the proactive side of this project. Artificial nests are being installed, but they're not actually being used just yet. Earlier, we mentioned how sacred falcons will hopefully return to the area in which they were released to breed. For that to work, there needs to be available breeding habitat, but that doesn't really exist in Bulgaria. Sacred falcons don't build their own nests. They use the nests of other large raptors, nests that have been abandoned. But due to a decline in overall bird species throughout Bulgaria from pollution and habitat loss and things like that, and illegal hunting, there aren't many extra nests lying around for sacred falcons to use. So artificial nests, or these man-made nests, are necessary to fill in those gaps. To highlight a few of the major points of this paper, one major element was that there wasn't any compiled information on the design of these nests, which is really critical for the stage that they're at right now. So to give you a sense of size, you can either look at this picture of Rusko and his son testing out a nest to see if it is nice and comfy. Rusko's about this tall, a little shorter than me. Or if you're familiar with the metric system, you can refer to these diagrams. These have approximate measurements of these nests. And I say approximate because each one varies a little bit. They're all within a few centimeters of this size. But I was told it's not too important if they're exact because a bird wouldn't have a measuring tape that it's building a nest. So not really a problem. These nests are these steel frames in kind of a circle shape. It's this really lightweight frame. They had tried to use wood in the past, but the wood rotted really quickly. Especially when water got in the bottom. Now it's got a steel grate on it, but before water would just collect on the wood and rot away. They're hoping these nests with metal will last about 20 to 30 years, if not longer, so more than the wooden nests. Once you have the frame, the outside is wrapped in vines, and then once it's installed, you fill it with sticks and leaves and just make a lovely comfy bed. These nests are placed in old growth trees, so any tree that is really tall and strong has strong limbs that can support the weight of the nest with everything in it. And they're usually near agricultural fields or ideally pastures that have rodent populations, as Molly mentioned, they need for a food source. Finding big trees was one of the biggest problems and biggest challenges of this part of the project. Most of them in the area around Stara Zagora, where these nests have been placed, have been cut down for agricultural expansion. So a lot of the time was spent scouting areas to put nests and determining if a tree was going to be good enough, and then, or if they could even find trees. And once they found a tree, make sure that it actually had suitable surrounding habitat. And finally, as a final step, when you are installing a nest, this white paint-like substance is added in the nest. It's meant to mimic bird poop. That way, other birds, when they're flying by, especially sacred falcons, can look at it and go, oh, someone used that before. It's probably good. That means there's probably a food source and it's a safe area to live in. So they will hopefully, that will encourage them to use that nest. From 2020 to 2021, so these past 2 summers, Green Balkans installed 20 artificial nests around Stara Zagora, where the current hack sites are. And they plan to install 30 more over the next 3 years. None of them are currently being used by sacred falcons, and that was to be expected. The birds they've released in this area have only been released in the past couple of years. So they expect these nests to start being used either next year or the following, once these birds have sexually matured and return to breed. And again, this is a proactive part of reintroduction. Since there aren't really any results in terms of nest use yet, it's really important to set up future monitoring plans for making sure that they're monitoring sacred falcon activity with these nests. And as Molly mentioned, both of these papers were done with a lot of interviews and not much of the information was written down. It was really held in the heads of just a few individuals. So we're still doing a lot of back and forth to ensure that essential information is included and everything is fully accurate. And hopefully we can get those to a point where in the near future, we can get them published. Yeah, so with that, I'm going to move on to our second deliverable, which is bird bios. As we were working on the Sacred Falcon project, we felt that it was a lot of internal work, but what we were doing day to day dealt a lot with the public. So we wanted to capture those interactions by adding the second deliverable, which we have deemed bird bios. It added this element of social marketing and public outreach to our project. And these bios are a series of short profiles on the birds on public display at Green Balkan's Visitors Corner. We wrote about 18 birds and tried to capture 3 main points in every profile. So to start, we wanted to showcase the individual personality of each bird to make an emotional appeal to members of the public. We wanted to inform the public about species issues so they could see how to make a difference and increase the environmental education. And we wanted to make an appeal for donations by highlighting Green Balkan's work for species conservation. These profiles are meant to mimic the profiles you would see on a staff page on the website. So just a short little bio. That is because we are in the process of getting them put on Green Balkan's staff page. A lot of the staff members mentioned they consider the birds to be members of the staff because they're out working with the public, educating people. And putting it on their website is also a great way to reach a larger audience, more so than the people who can come to Stars Agora and see the birds in person.
Yeah, so with that, we're going to describe the methodology, kind of the inspiration behind this whole idea. So first we kind of thought, well, we could create some social media posts with these to help generate donations, but that's kind of like a one-time thing. Then we thought we could do a QR code links and link those to some stories that you can find online so that people can do self-guided tours at the visitor center. And then we thought we could create signs at the visitor center with these stories, and we finally settled on creating these staff bios for them. So to get there, we again conducted a lot of semi-formal and informal interviews. We kind of gotten to know the personalities of these birds, but we wanted the information from people who had known these birds for quite a while and also knew their medical history. We also did quite a bit of research to figure out how to correctly convey this information. We wanted people to care enough that they would donate and they would help conserve and do the right thing, but not care enough to the point of wanting to take these birds home and care for them themselves. So we have to kind of find that fine line. And then we also wanted to kind of engage a little bit more with these surveys. And so we created the survey here with the help of some Bulgarian friends. We got it translated, and it was linked through a QR code. And we basically just had 4 questions about the visitor's experience at the center, what we could do to improve, things like that. And we were told we wouldn't get many responses, but Rosie and I carried forth optimistically nonetheless. We put them up mid-July, took them down mid-August, so the survey was open for about a month, and we got a whopping 4 responses. And they were very thoughtful though. And so we used the information that we got from those, and we kind of helped guide our process. And so we kind of decided QR codes maybe don't work. That could be due to the fact that the visitors themselves kind of dropped in attendance during that time. It was midsummer, people were going on vacation. And it could also be due to a number of other factors. So we kind of dropped the QR code idea. We also realized that every single visitor is accompanied by a staff member, so creating signs would be redundant. And also through our time at the Uzana Festival, we kind of saw people gain that personal connection to birds, which really helped drive donations. We talked to them with the bird, and then they go put money in the donation box. So we kind of wanted to capture this, and from there we arrived on bird bios. In terms of where we're at now, we're working on getting those translated. We're running into some issues because of staff shortages. And so we are quite optimistic, though. We've got a couple of people there who are super excited about it, are really looking forward to translating them and putting them up on the website. So we're not too worried about it, but that is kind of where we're at right now. But here is the visitor corner survey. In the version that we gave to the public, it didn't have any of the English on it because every single visitor there was Bulgarian. So that's kind of what it looked like for them. And then here are some examples of the actual bird bios themselves.
Yeah, so obviously these are a little too small to read, but just to give you a sense of their length and kind of what they look like. To stick with the theme of Sacred Falcons, we wanted to highlight Romeo, the Sacred Falcon. To make an emotional appeal, we talk about how he is a real romantic, very true to his name. And he also is is the oldest Sacred Falcon in captivity. To add to that informational element and education element, as well as highlight Green Balkan's work, we talk a bit about the Sacred Falcon Reintroduction project, and we also link to the project page for that Reintroduction project. And that page also makes a direct appeal for donations, asking people to donate to that project. Another example is Pressy, the Dalmatian pelican. Our emotional appeal there is that she's quite shy at first, but is feisty once you get to know her. To inform people about issues for this species and highlight Green Balkan's work, We talk about a rescue mission that Molly got to participate in to save a group of these pelicans earlier in the summer who had run into some electrical wires, which is a frequent problem with pelicans. We link to a blog post that has more information on that incident and the recovery of those pelicans while they were at Green Balkans. And that kind of wraps up our project components, some of our major findings and experiences. So with that, we want to move on to just wrap up with some of our major takeaways from this project.
Yeah, the conclusions and major takeaways. So this is a very exciting time for conservation, but it's also a relatively difficult time in Bulgaria's history right now. They've got a lot going on. And so if we want to look at this through a critical lens, Bulgaria has had a very long history, but hasn't spent much of that time independent from the rule of other nations. And so during their latest round of countrywide independence, they're quickly pushed into these Western European measurements of success. One thing that has remained constant, though, is this top-down governance, which has led to a number of frustrations. One of the things that it kind of leads to is this difference in communication than what we're used to. The manager tends to communicate one thing, they say they want it done however they want it done, when they want it done, and they expect it to be done by that time. And in return, they expect clear and constant communication from their staff members, but they are not beholden to the same time constraints, or the manager is not beholden to these same constraints. And we witnessed this at the center quite a bit, and we saw how frustrated it made the staff. But we also kind of found that it was a more normalized thing to do in their culture. And then also at Green Balkans with this top-down style, it means that ideas are rarely accepted or implemented unless it comes from higher up management folks, no matter the experience level or innovation that others provide. And this is true when it comes to feeding the birds, day-to-day operations, structuring breeding programs, how to care for birds at outreach events. Like it affects everything that they do. And so some things to consider for future CLTL students are these differences. The communication styles are totally different. A number of times Rosie and I would get a text at 11:30 at night asking us to be ready by 7:30 a.m. the next day. So sometimes you just kind of have to go with the flow and be ready for that. And then I also want to specifically mention the use of the term management. I've been very specific in that they don't lead their employees. It's a very management focused thing where you do this, and there's very little like actual leadership that's happening. And then also this idea of self-interest. If a problem occurs, the manager will typically pass the blame out to whoever they feel is most expendable. And they don't really accept the blame, which is something that we kind of had to struggle with and get used to. And we had a lot of conversations about it. So just some considerations in the future. There are differences, and a lot of them can be linked culturally to the differences in like how they just govern themselves. But then with that, we want to go a little bit into accountability, especially.
Yeah, so we do want to hit on this idea of accountability. Green Balkans is a one-of-a-kind organization in Bulgaria. It's the oldest conservation nonprofit in the country, and it is one of very few environmental NGOs and the only wildlife rehab center in the country. Therefore, there aren't really many other groups for them to compare their work or their workplace cultures to. And combined with that, there's a lack of government oversight or just outside oversight of any kind. So it's really up to Green Balkans to hold itself accountable for its organizational actions. Green Balkans has a really fast-paced and sometimes chaotic environment. There are always calls coming in, things that need to be done every day. And that kind of an environment can really impede the needed level of self-reflection to uphold one's own accountability. As a result, we felt we witnessed some lapses in animal care and in organizational management. We were told this kind of self-accountability is a countrywide thing, as Molly had mentioned, but it was a concept that we really grappled with during this time, because things weren't always kept up to the standards that were being publicly promoted, and we really struggled with that idea. That said, Green Balkans work is really critical to restoring and maintaining Bulgaria's biodiversity, but there is an opportunity for self-improvement and organizational improvement. And with that, we would like to share some of our recommendations.
Yeah, so our projects, like what we produce, are mostly self-contained. Future students may not want to continue the exact projects that we were doing because they get redundant. We've already compiled the information that was floating around nebulously. And if there's opportunity in continued monitoring, but that will most likely be carried out internally by Green Balkans. We also find that any facility designed and created to conserve wildlife and protect wildlife, that wildlife should be the priority. It's easy to miss nuances in care, but with more careful and thoughtful leadership and sharing knowledge, especially among those who are working directly with the birds, those birds will receive the optimal care. And in terms of continuing research here, we may not necessarily recommend continuing research with Green Balkans, but the area itself is incredibly important. There's a huge amount of potential for future research in the Balkan region, whether it's in Bulgaria or not. And conservation here is really at a critical point. This is kind of like the future for conservation is really decided at this time. There's a lot of unique biodiversity that is at risk of being lost forever if nothing is done and if things aren't done correctly at this point. And it's really interesting because right now they're doing a lot of things that have been done in the past, but they're not really looking towards the future as much right now. And it's such a unique region that they really have to tailor it in very unique ways. I mean, you saw our web of social ecological systems for only our project. It's very complicated. So imagine that on a bigger scale with all these different countries, internationally speaking. And it's really unique because there are a lot of different governance structures in this area. Some countries were a part of the were a part of the USSR. Some of them weren't at all. And right now, some of them are a part of the EU. Some of them are a part of the specialized Schengen zone of the EU, and some of them aren't even part of the EU at all. And so that leads to a lot of differences in communication and governance structure, and there's really no unifying factor, which makes everything way more difficult and all the more fascinating. And so since there's so much happening here, we can't really recommend, or like we don't necessarily recommend continuing the exact work that we did, but continuing to do things here, if not just for a case study in the complexities of social ecological systems in the area, because it really is a treasure trove for potential and creating impactful conservation measures in the future. And it was just fascinating to delve into because there's so much happening and so much that we didn't even include here that we could go on about. But with that, we're gonna shift over to our reflections, kind of wrap up.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about our experience at this, and we had a couple of combined reflections that we wanted to share. One is that this really was a true opportunity to take on a leadership role. We were put in quite a free-floating and chaotic environment, which was a lot of fun, but also it meant we really had to make sure we were doing adequate planning and goal setting, that we were working effectively with others and continually promoting our projects, especially when things got busy, and that we were being as flexible as possible when day-to-day activities took priority over our overarching goals. And as a result, we were able to produce product that we're pretty proud of and happy that we were able to contribute to. Another one of our reflections that we want to share in opportunities for growth was that this was a really wonderful opportunity to build some really impactful relationships. One of the ways we did that was we asked people a lot of questions because we didn't know what was going on most of the time. But instead of sharing our immediate thoughts on it, it was, what do you think? We would ask people, what do you think of this? And what's your opinion on this? What exactly is going on? And the more we asked people those types of questions, the more they started sharing their ideas openly. And that even led to instances where before they would have kept quiet about something they were uncomfortable with and that they knew shouldn't be done in a specific way, especially in relation to animal care. And the more we asked them what their ideas were, the more they felt comfortable in sharing those ideas, especially around animal welfare. So they started speaking up more throughout our time there, and being able to have that kind of an impact, see that kind of a change over our time there was just really amazing to see that questions can be really powerful. And with that, we're going to move on to a couple of individual reflections.
Yay. So this is me with Philip. Philip was one of the friends I made this summer. He's a pelican, if you can't tell. That was, it was a lot of growth for me just to be able to do this and to gain his trust and to trust him. But I just, some things, I've been very, very fortunate in my past to have amazing supervisors and role models and people that I can look up to. And this was one of the first not great experiences I had with management. I saw so many frustrations in how things were run. And it was like, they're micromanaging while also being absent. And it's like a rotten tooth that makes the whole mouth go bad. It doesn't feel good. And it taught me kind of what to avoid in the future, both in myself and in future organizations. And then I also didn't necessarily have the easiest summer by any stretch of the imagination. I don't typically prefer to cut up dead baby things every day, but I did, and I grew a lot. And one of those things that I really worked on is through these leadership inventories was I consistently score pretty low on my flexibility and adaptability to changing circumstances. And so I was quite determined to work on that this summer. Part of it might stem from anxiety, but like I really wanted to work on it because I know it's a problem. And so I did. And, you know, I owe a lot of it to Rosie, who stuck with me on my struggle bus, and she kind of kept inviting me to these things. And if plans change, it was very nice to have somebody to talk to, especially when you get a text at 11:30 at night as you're trying to fall asleep. And, you know, I got to learn to just kind of take those deep breaths. Know that if I wasn't happy or comfortable, it didn't really matter because I kind of had to go with it anyways. And so I genuinely worked on it, and I really improved on it. And I'm sure it has been very helpful to Rosie. And it's super easy to look back on time right now and find these positives from it. But at the time, it was quite the struggle, but we worked through it. And I made a friend, very good friend. So with that, I'll send it over to Rosie.
This was probably the best day I ever had. After we opened a box full of baby tortoises. But yeah, I definitely want to echo Molly's thoughts on learning what to look for in a workplace culture and how important the people that you're working with is to the work that you're doing and how proud you can be of that work. I also learned an awful lot about how to effectively build relationships. There were a lot of situations where there were a lot of hands in a project, and there would be like 10 people standing in a room with 2 people actually doing something. My response to those situations is usually to go find a different project where I can feel like I'm being a little more useful, but that's also a very isolating thing to do sometimes because you're not interacting with those other people. Molly had a huge knack for making any 1-person project a 2-person project, if not a 3 or 4-person project. And that was a really awesome thing that I was able to learn from her, because when you do that, even if it is something that could be done by 1 person, if there are 2 people there working on it together, you can talk with them a lot, you can ask them a lot of questions, and it's a really great opportunity to get to know those people and form some strong connections with them. With that, we want to just give a big thank you to everyone at the Green Balkans that we got to meet and work with, and who answered our endless questions, and just really provided us with a lot of great information and made our experience a really wonderful one. And also to all of the birds that we met. I mean, they really made it a unique experience, and it's a pretty neat thing to be able to say you have a pelican for a friend. So with that, we've got our work cited, and we are happy to answer any questions.
We definitely have time for probably a couple of questions. I think we'll turn over to committees.
How did your relationship with the indigenous people go?
Like the idea of indigenous people in Bulgaria is very interesting because of their long history. Bulgarians are kind of the main groups there. There are a few other ethnic groups that we learned a little bit about. One of the main groups was with the Roma, and we didn't have a chance to interact with them much because there really wasn't any opportunity to. They were kind of isolated to a few specific neighborhoods, or they were more migrant people. We did hear a lot of kind of detrimental comments about them. So there wasn't a hugely positive attitude toward that group of people. And it was something that we did find out. We asked a lot of questions about that to say, how does this affect what you're doing? Do these people get involved in the projects you're doing at all? And the answer was no, not really.
Yeah.
We talk about that a little bit more in some of our deliverables and some of the papers that we produced for this, but just about how that would be a really important knowledge source to include, because it is a pretty significant bit of population, and they are in a lot of the areas where these projects are taking place. But our experience with that was pretty limited.
Yeah, they're pretty racist towards the Roma.
Yeah.
As in very racist towards the Roma. And, you know, otherwise we'd see like just kind of with everybody else, all the native Bulgarians, at the festivals we go to, they do their dances, traditional dances, and they just kind of get together as a group, everybody together. So we kind of witnessed that, which was really cool and unique. But yeah, so they're very proud of their culture. They engage in it and a lot. We learned how their traditional archery worked from from Addie, who was one of the staff members we got to know quite well. And so, you know, we had these glimpses with it, but there was also quite a bit of racism that happened.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go for it.
With the issues or concerns with management, did you guys feel when you got there that you got like adequate training on everything, or was it very much just like do what you're told, learn as you go?
We were in a kind of an odd situation where like we were definitely thrown into things, and for the first week, we had no idea what we were doing every day. Because no one ever told us what we were supposed to be doing every day. So we had to slowly piece that together, and got to a point where we were comfortable, knew what we were doing, knew what might be coming up and what to be aware of. But Green Balkans has a ton of volunteers constantly coming through their organization. So that sometimes volunteers were there for a week, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes a month. We were there for a really long time. And we also benefited from this idea that because we were graduate students and we were producing some information for Green Balkans, that helped elevate us a little bit and give us a little more leeway in what we were allowed to do and what information we were able to figure out and how we were included in day-to-day functions. So that was one helpful thing, but it was definitely something where you're just thrown into it and it's meant to be like chaotic fun, which would be great for a week, but not for 3 months.
Yeah, management tends to just kind of like drop you off and be like, here, somebody else will take care of you, which we did. We made a number of friends who really helped look after us. And we also noticed over time, like initially management, they were like, yeah, come on to these things. We'll bring you to this, to go to this. And then after about a month, they just kind of forgot that we were there kind of in a way sometimes, unless it was to do artificial nest things. Which was really interesting because then new volunteers come in and then they get really excited about them. And then kind of the longer that you're there, the more you just kind of like seep into the cracks. We also, in terms of like bird handling, because we went to the event, we handled some birds, and I had never held a bird before in my life. So this was quite a new experience and I had no clue what I was doing. But we were taught by some very kind people that we met as well. And theoretically, everybody who goes to these events who are volunteers, they're supposed to get trained by George, who is the Sacred Falcon breeding manager, and he's someone we got to know very well. And that doesn't always happen, but since I was very concerned about holding a bird, especially for like hours on end, I was like, you need to teach me things. And he's like, yes, we were going to spend an afternoon doing it. And so he sat me down and he showed me everything I needed to know. And he helped kind of build that over the summer as well. It wasn't just like a one-time thing. So through our individual connections with staff members, it didn't come from management, it came from people that we got to know.
Yeah, those connections that we were able to make with the staff members was really key to being able to have a good experience over the summer. Whereas management just kind of floated off, and when they came in, it was sometimes a frustrating experience, but the people that we interacted with every day just really made it a positive overall experience.
Do the Sacred Falcons migrate at all?
Yes.
They do. So you guys touched a bit about like Green Balkan's relationship internally,
Mhm.
but like where do like the Sacred Falcons like migrate to, and do Green Balkans have any relationship with any wildlife centers or anything like that in those areas?
Yeah, so they've got a number of international partners. We didn't necessarily work with them very much, so we can't speak on kind of who those partners are or how involved they are. But it is a part of a larger network to monitor the Sacred Falcons where they're going, because they go all throughout Europe and then they go all the way down to even Northern Africa, I believe. And so they kind of have this very wide range, and Bulgaria sits kind of right in the middle of that. And so we kind of got a glimpse into that vastness, but we didn't get to directly interact with them because our role was more at the center with what the center was producing through their breeding program.
And as we mentioned with funding, so the funders for the Sacred Falcon project are based in the UAE, and they are funding this project because they want more Sacred Falcons to be in the UAE. They want birds to migrate down there that they can then capture for falconry and use for a couple of years and then release again. So that was one of the big motivations for this project as kind of an external funding point. But for Bulgaria and for Green Balkans, it was more about, we want these birds back in the country because they're a really culturally significant bird. We find them important. So, and
There's the Polish zoo.
Oh, yeah.
So they get a number, so the actual breeding birds that they have, they've gotten a number of them from a zoo in Poland, which is pretty interesting. And then they've also gotten some from Jemima Perry Jones.
Mhm.
Yeah, she's like a premier falconry lady worldwide, very renowned, and she's based in England, I believe.
Yeah.
And so she's also donated a number of her birds and also money to the program, to the Sacred Falcons and stuff. But yeah.
yeah, and
we
in
didn't get
terms of, for a lot of the other bird species as well, especially with like vultures, they migrate a lot too. When birds are released, they have a little chip put in them so you can track them in the surrounding countries and the NGOs in those countries have partnerships with Green Balkans so they can make sure they're tracking those birds wherever they're moving and have a sense of what their migration patterns are and what happens if they die. They can figure out, okay, this was something that happened, over in Romania, and here's exactly what's going on. So.
Cool, thank you.
We're gonna call that good. Thanks for your questions. We need to preserve a little bit of time for your meeting. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. If you're